Hello, and welcome to Title Talk in Real Estate in New York. I'm Brenda Posner, and today we have Stephanie Zwirn with us.
Hey, Brenda.
So, Stephanie, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself before we get started?
I'm a real estate attorney for 31 years. I've known since I was 5 I wanted to do it. And I really come to my clients and the brokers I work with just a lot of information, availability, speed, and strength, because I know that that's what makes me feel good to get a deal closed.
Okay, so today we're talking about HDFCs. So for those people out there that don't know what they are, what is an HDFC?
HDFC stands for Housing Development Fund Corporation, and it's particular to co-ops. So it's not if you're buying a house or it's not if you're buying a condo, it's affordable housing in co-ops. So where did it come about? In the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of abandoned buildings, and the city would come in and they would take them over, or very mismanaged buildings as well. The city came in, they fixed up the buildings, they educated the tenants that were in there, and then they sold these apartments to those tenants as to become shareholders for either $0 or $250. So, and they had homes, and the idea was that the city would help them to create these homes and make them sustainable. It's really not for people to profit from necessarily, although people have. The idea is that people could have a home, and there's affordability restrictions, so you can only make a certain amount of money. So the city has guidelines for what it is. And so let's just say what it is: 165% of the area median income, or based on a calculation for what maintenance and their utilities are. But each co-op is different. And so I think the biggest message that I could say today is that I want to make sure that you understand each co-op is different in their guidelines. So when you're going to go to an HDFC co-op, before you even make your application and make your agreed upon price, understand what those restrictions are in that particular building. And when I talk about the particular restriction, it's how you would get in financially, and do you meet that?
Okay. So why is it important to have a knowledgeable attorney that really specializes in HDFC?
Oh, I would say, just like you wouldn't want to have your pediatrician do your neurology work, you wouldn't want to have an HDFC by an attorney who doesn't practice real estate, then take it up a notch. You want to make sure that real estate attorney also practices residential real estate. And for this, you need to take it up a higher notch and say that that residential real estate attorney in New York also needs to have a lot of knowledge about HDFC. If they don't, they're going to be missing requirements that you need to be accepted into the building, and then also for how you would live in the building, and most importantly, also how you would one day sell the apartment. You want to know what these restrictions are. For one thing, Brenda and I were working on together was when you're going to do a resale in mainstream co-ops, you have to pay the New York City real estate transfer tax. In HDFCs, when the co-op is doing the initial sale, they don't have to pay that tax. And it's important to know these things before you go into the deal.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. So that's one of the differences versus, compared to a mainstream. What are some of the other differences between a mainstream New York City purchase and an HDFC purchase?
That's a great question, Brenda. When you're purchasing in a mainstream co-op, you put through your board application, you have your interview, and you get accepted by the board, and then you can schedule to close. With HDFC, there's this added layer of approval by HDC, it's the city agency. And so once you get your board approval from the co-op, you now need to make your application to HDC for approval. And I would say pre-pandemic, I don't think it was pandemic related though, pre-pandemic, when you applied to HDFC, it was almost like a rubber stamp. If the co-op approved you, it was really just about a 2-week wait, and then you would be approved by HDC. Now what I'm seeing is that sometimes, not often, but sometimes it's not just a rubber stamp of approval, and sometimes HDC can even disapprove transactions that were approved by the co-op. The other difference that I see is that it usually takes about 3 weeks now, delayed from being able to close if you're purchasing in a mainstream. The biggest difference is the income requirements. So when you're purchasing in an HDFC, There's income restrictions. We mentioned them before, based on the median income and also the maintenance and utilities. You have to know, it's so important, what each co-op needs. So they might have different requirements. I'm working on one in the Bronx where the amount of money for the apartment, the agreed upon price is like $199. But the income restriction for it is a person cannot make more than $35,000 a year to be eligible to purchase in this building, right? There's another one that's downtown on the Lower East Side, and it's being marketed for $1.2 million, and the income restriction is $435,000 a year. I don't know how that qualifies as affordable housing, but somebody who's making $435,000 a year can purchase in this building. So that's why it's so important to understand these guidelines before you actually go in and make your offer. You want to have all of this information prior regarding the income restrictions and how you can get in. Another difference from mainstream to HDFC is that HDFC looks at your income. They look back 2 years on your income to see if you meet the income requirement. They're really not looking at your assets. So it's important that your income is reflective of what's required. I know that it also depends. They sort of look at assets a little bit as far as where your second home is going to be. If you have a second home, be careful, because if that second home is up in Maine and it's an 8-hour drive, they're not going to be saying, oh, you can drive 8 hours back and forth every day to get to work in New York City. So they might not consider that second home. But if you live, let's say, up in the Catskills and it's an 1.5-hour drive, they could look at that second home and say, you don't need an affordable home in Manhattan because you can travel an 1.5 hours each way to get to work in Manhattan. So they don't really look at your assets, but they will look at if you have a second home. So you want to be careful with that. Some other things, HDC approval and whether or not you have a second home. When you're purchasing in an HDFC versus a regular mainstream co-op, there's this additional agreement. It's called a regulatory agreement. So if you're purchasing in a mainstream co-op, you have an agreement with the co-op, and that's your proprietary lease, and that entitles you to live in the space so long as you follow the rules of the co-op. There's this added layer when you're purchasing with HDFC, and it's an agreement that you have with the city. It's the co-op, you and the city have this regulatory agreement, and it lasts for 25 years, and you have to follow those rules in order to be compliant and get the benefit of HDFC. And so benefits of HDFC, lower cost of the apartment, lower maintenance. And then there's guidelines that you need to follow. For instance, the flip tax. That's a big difference also, Brenda. The flip tax in a mainstream co-op could be 1% to 3%. That's generally what I see. And it's usually the calculation is what the sale price of the apartment is, and you subtract what you purchased the apartment from, and then generally you get to also deduct the broker's commission from it. And then you would multiply that by 1% or 3% or whatever the flip tax is in the mainstream building. Go to a co-op for HDFC, and that percentage from 1% to 3% could jump from like 30% to 30%. I would say that that's the customary number that I see for a flip tax for an HDFC. And I've even seen it as high as 70%. Because if you think about it, the idea is you're not supposed to be profiting from these apartments. You're supposed to be able to have a home to live in. And then when you don't need it anymore, you're passing it on to somebody else who needs an affordable home. But again, look at each co-op, because each co-op has its own flip tax calculation and percentage. So that's very important. And then, with the regulatory agreement, that's really important as well. I get so excited about all this stuff. With the regulatory agreement, that added agreement that you have with HDFC apartments, a regulatory agreement will last for 25 years from the date it became an HDFC. And that's really important because at the 25-year marker, the HDFC, the shareholders have an opportunity to vote and say whether they want to stay in HDFC and get the benefits of the lower maintenance, for instance, or they can jump out of HDFC and become a market rate apartment. So that's a really important thing for your attorney to know to look at when they're doing their due diligence. Is this HDFC going to expire soon? So let's say you're 23 years into the HDFC, the regulatory agreement, and it could expire in 2 years. that could greatly impact the amount of money you're going to spend on your HDFC, or as the seller, the amount of money that you could get from it. If you're a seller of an HDFC and it's at year 23, expiring at year 25, it's important for your attorney to look into it and find out, does this building want to jump out of HDFC? Because then if it's market rate, you could charge a lot more for that apartment. And so it's really important for the value of the apartment to know if you're going to be in HDFC or getting out of it for market value, but also for how the co-op is going to function. Very important.
Yeah, definitely. So what do buyers need to know about HDFCs? And where are these apartments?
Good questions. A lot of these apartments, I would say, are in Upper Manhattan. On the Lower East Side, there's ones in Brooklyn and the Bronx. That's what I would say the most of them are. There's some on the Midtown West Side, also in Hell's Kitchen, but those are the areas. And then it's really, if you want to live in these areas, definitely go look. I've seen some apartments that had all of the views of the apartment were on Central Park. And you could get some great apartments. There's some that are on 110th Street overlooking the park. There's a great one that's on 106th Street that overlooks the park. They're great apartments to look for. What was your other question, Brenda?
So what do buyers need to know about the HDFCs?
Oh, okay. So obviously you're bound by that regulatory agreement we were talking about. You're going to need HDC approval. We did mention that. You want to know that you income-wise can fit into this building before you bother to go make your application to them, because you don't want to waste your time or your money. In addition, each HDFC is different, so it's really important to know where you fit into it, and also personality-wise. Like any other co-op, again, they cannot be discriminatory, but you want to make sure that your personality and your goals fit with the goals of this HDFC. There's some of them that are so to the letter of the regulations in the HDFC, and there's other ones that operate as mainstream buildings. There's one HDFC building on 116th Street that operates so much like a mainstream building. They have a doorman, they have a rooftop playground and an area that you could go barbecue your food. It's like a mainstream co-op, but the downside of that is that the maintenance is really high in that building. So the prices of the apartments are much lower than mainstream in that HDFC, but the monthly costs are higher in that one. So there's always a yin yang. What are some other things? Whether or not you can sublet in these buildings. There's usually, if you're going to sublet your apartment, then that person who's subletting has to meet all of the same requirements that you have to meet. So it's very important to understand that when you're purchasing in an HDFC, you're really not purchasing it to make a huge profit when you sell it one day. You're there because it's an affordable place to live. Also, what's important is the type of person that usually can get into these buildings. It used to be that it was, solely, let's say, on your income, and it was very clear, and you got the 250 shares for $250. But now these apartments have become so much more expensive. Let's just say a one bedroom could be $350,000, right? So if you think about it, somebody who's making a low enough amount to be able to be approved into this building might not have $70,000 for the down payment. So what ends up happening is that you have a certain type of person who's going to be able to have a low enough income, but enough of a down payment. Who are those people? I would say an ideal candidate would be, let's say, somebody who's graduating college and they have a job in marketing and they're making $35,000 a year. Bam, they make it for the income restriction, but they probably don't have $70,000 in their bank account to make it for the down payment. So maybe their parents have it and they can step in. So that's not really the type of person who is supposed to be for an affordable housing unit where their parents have money, but they meet the requirements as needed in that particular HDFC. Another person, and I like this idea, it's a little bit more altruistic than the other ones, but a senior citizen. A senior citizen does not have a lot of income because they're not working anymore, so their income is low enough, but they might have assets where they could afford the down payment. So they end up being, a good person for an affordable housing unit.
So when somebody is looking to do this, somebody's looking to buy an HDFC, when do you suggest that they call you?
It's interesting because a lot of people call their attorney when they have an accepted offer. And that's when you have to hit the ground running. I actually think that when you're looking for an HDFC apartment, call me. I operate on a flat fee basis. It's not hourly. So if you bring me in sooner, you have access to me sooner for whatever questions you might have. And we might be able to look at the regulatory agreement or the offering plan of this particular HDFC and see if you would qualify, if you are a good candidate. Otherwise, you don't want to be wasting your time. Also, I would say it's really important to work with a very knowledgeable real estate broker. The brokers have a lot of information about the particular buildings from the outset, and they won't bring you to buildings that you would walk into and say, this is perfect for me, it's home. And then you find out shortly thereafter that you're not a candidate for this building. So definitely a good broker is very important as well.
Okay. Well, I think we got a lot of information about HDFCs today, and you know who to call now, everyone. So thanks so much, Stephanie.
My pleasure, Brenda. Thanks for the opportunity.
Everybody have a great day.